You know, dear ones, they say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, mine took 25 years to prepare, and when I finally served it, it was absolutely perfect. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old now. For most of my life, I believed I was worthless, because that's what my brother Richard told me every single day for 48 years. He controlled my money, my decisions, even where I could live. He called me stupid, lazy, a burden on the family. But in 2013, when I was 65 years old, I discovered something that changed everything. Richard had been stealing from me, not just my inheritance, but my entire life savings. Over $200,000 gone. What I did next, well, some might call it justice, others might call it revenge, but I call it finally learning to value myself. If you're ready to hear how a scared little girl became a woman who fights back, please hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will show you that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Let me take you back to 1955, when I was 7 years old and Richard was 12. We lived in a small farmhouse outside Bakersfield, California, one of those places where the summer heat shimmers off the fields and the nearest neighbour is half a mile away. Our parents, God rest their souls, were hard-working people. Mama worked at the local diner, serving coffee and pie to truckers passing through on Highway 99. Daddy ran a small auto repair shop behind our house. You could always hear the clank of tools and smell motor oil hanging in the air. But here's what shaped everything that came after. When I was 7 and Richard was 12, Daddy had his first heart attack. Mama was beside herself with worry and medical bills. She needed help managing everything, and Richard stepped right up. "Eleanor's too little to understand," he'd tell Mama. "Let me handle the important stuff. She can just play with her dolls." And Mama, bless her heart, was so grateful for his help that she never questioned it. Richard started handling the grocery money, the bill paying, even counting the cash from Daddy's repair shop each evening. He'd sit at our kitchen table with all those papers spread out, looking so serious and responsible. I remember standing in the doorway in my little yellow nightgown, watching him work by the light of that old brass lamp. The numbers on those papers might as well have been hieroglyphics to me then, but Richard would look up and shoo me away. "This isn't for little girls, Eleanor. Go play somewhere else." That phrase. "This isn't for little girls." I must have heard it 1,000 times growing up, when Daddy was explaining how to change a car's oil, when Mama was balancing the checkbook, when relatives came over to discuss family business. Always the same message. Eleanor doesn't need to know. Eleanor can't understand. Eleanor should go play somewhere else. By the time I turned 16 in 1964, this pattern was set in stone. Richard had graduated high school and started working at the bank in town, First National Bank of Kern County, a solid brick building that seemed to represent everything important and grown up that I wasn't allowed to understand. He'd come home in his pressed white shirts and narrow ties, talking about interest rates and loan applications like he was some kind of financial wizard. Mama would hang on his every word, nodding along even when I could tell she didn't understand half of what he was saying either. "Richard's so smart with money," she'd tell the neighbours. "Takes after his father that way. Eleanor now, she's more the artistic type." Artistic type, that was their polite way of saying I wasn't bright enough for practical matters. Because I liked to draw pictures and read novels, because I preferred walking in the fields to sitting with columns of numbers, I was somehow less capable of managing real-world responsibilities. The thing is, I started believing it myself. When you hear something often enough, especially from people who are supposed to love you, it becomes your truth. I genuinely thought I was too scatterbrained, too impractical, too feminine to handle important things like money and legal documents. This belief shaped every major decision in my life. In 1966, when I graduated high school, Richard convinced me not to apply to the state college in Fresno. "College is expensive, Eleanor, and honestly, do you really think you'd do well? Maybe you should find a nice job, save some money, meet a good man to take care of you." So instead of college, I took a job at Woolworths in downtown Bakersfield, selling fabric and notions to ladies who came in with their dress patterns. It wasn't terrible work. I enjoyed helping customers pick out colours and textures, and I had a good eye for what would look nice together. But it paid just enough to cover my room and board at home, with maybe $10 left over each week for myself. $10 that Richard insisted I put in a savings account he'd opened for me at his bank. "You can't be trusted to keep cash around, Eleanor. You'll just spend it on magazines and lipstick. Better to let the bank hold it for you. Earn a little interest." I was 18 years old, and I let my 23-year-old brother open a savings account in my name. Worse, I let him keep the passbook for safekeeping, so I wouldn't lose it. Looking back now, I want to shake that young woman. I want to grab her by the shoulders and say, "Eleanor, you have every right to control your own money. You're not stupid, you're just untrained." But hindsight is always perfect, isn't it? At the time, I was grateful that someone was looking out for my financial welfare. This arrangement continued for 3 years. Every Friday, I'd hand my paycheck to Richard, and he'd deposit most of it into my savings account, giving me back just enough for lunch money and a few personal items. He'd show me the balance sometimes, watching it grow from $50 to $200, then $500, then over $1,000 by 1969. "See how well you're doing, Eleanor. This is what happens when you're responsible with money instead of just spending it willy-nilly." I felt proud of that growing balance, like I was finally doing something right. Richard would pat my head like I was still 7 years old. "Good girl, keep this up and you'll have a nice little nest egg when you get married." When I get married. Not if, when. Because of course that was my ultimate destiny, to find a husband who would take over Richard's role of managing my life and finances. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. In 1970, when I was 22, I met James Patterson at a church social. He was 26, worked as a supervisor at the Tejon Ranch, and seemed like the steadiest man in Kern County. He had kind eyes and gentle hands, and when he asked me to dance, I felt like maybe this was the beginning of the life everyone expected me to have. James and I courted for 8 months before he proposed. During that time, Richard made sure to have several man-to-man conversations with him about my limitations. "Eleanor's a sweet girl," I overheard him saying one evening when James came to pick me up for a date. "But she's never been good with practical matters. Money, legal stuff, planning ahead. That's just not her strong suit. She'll need someone to handle all that for her." James nodded seriously, like they were discussing a medical condition I had. I understand. My mother was the same way. Some women just aren't built for that kind of thinking. Some women just aren't built for that kind of thinking. Those words cut deeper than I expected, but I pushed the hurt down. After all, these were the 2 men who cared about me most in the world. They were looking out for my best interests, weren't they? When James and I married in June 1971, Richard handled transferring my savings account, all 1,840 of it, into a joint account with my new husband. The 2 of them sat at the kitchen table with all the paperwork, discussing interest rates and investment options, while I packed my belongings in the next room. "This isn't for little girls" had become "this isn't for wives." Same message, different words. My marriage to James lasted 18 years, and they were fine. Not passionate, not terrible, just fine. He treated me kindly, never raised his voice or his hand, always made sure I had what I needed. He handled all our finances, gave me a household allowance each week, and made all the major decisions about where we lived and how we spent our money. I kept working at Woolworths until 1974, when I got pregnant with our daughter Sarah. James decided it would be better if I stayed home. "A child needs her mother," he said, and I agreed. After Sarah was born, my world shrank to the house, the grocery store, and church on Sundays. Don't get me wrong, I loved being Sarah's mother. She was the light of my life. A bright, curious little girl who asked a million questions about everything she saw. I read to her every night, taught her to draw and paint, took her on long walks through the fields where I'd grown up. But the financial isolation continued. James gave me exactly enough money each week to buy groceries and household supplies. If I needed anything extra, new shoes, a haircut, a birthday present for Sarah, I had to ask permission and explain why it was necessary. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Eleanor," he'd say gently. "We have to be careful with every dollar." I understood. I truly believed we were living paycheck to paycheck, that James was struggling to support our little family on his ranch supervisor salary. So I made do, mended clothes instead of buying new ones, cut my own hair, found creative ways to stretch every dollar he gave me. Meanwhile, Richard's career at the bank was flourishing. By 1975, he'd been promoted to assistant manager. By 1980, he was the manager. He bought a big house on the good side of town, drove a new Buick every 2 years, took vacations to places like Las Vegas and San Francisco. "Banking's been good to me," he'd say when we saw each other at family gatherings. "Course it helps to understand how money works, how to make it grow instead of just spending it." Always that little dig, that reminder that I wasn't smart enough to understand such things. When Daddy died in 1982, Richard handled everything. The funeral arrangements, settling the estate, selling the family house and auto shop. I was grieving and overwhelmed, grateful to have someone taking care of all those complicated details. "Don't worry about any of this, Eleanor," Richard assured me. "I'll make sure everything's handled properly. You just focus on taking care of Sarah." The estate wasn't huge, but it wasn't nothing either. The house and land sold for $47,000, and Daddy had a small life insurance policy worth another $15,000. After funeral expenses and debts, there should have been about $55,000 left to split between Richard and me. Richard showed me the paperwork, pages and pages of legal documents covered with numbers and official stamps. It was all gibberish to me, but he walked me through it patiently. "After taxes and legal fees, there's $31,000 left," he explained. "We'll split it evenly, $1,500 each. But Eleanor, I really think you should let me invest your portion for you. The stock market's doing well right now, and I've got some connections at the bank who can help us make this money grow." $15,500. It seemed like a fortune to me. And the idea of making it grow, well, that sounded wonderful. "Are you sure it's safe?" I asked. "Absolutely. Trust me, Eleanor. When have I ever steered you wrong?" So I signed the papers, didn't read them, didn't understand them, just signed where Richard pointed and trusted that my big brother was looking out for me. 3 years later, in 1985, when I asked Richard how my investment was doing, he got a strange look on his face. "Well, Eleanor, the market's been volatile lately. We've lost some ground. Nothing to panic about, but, well, your portion is down to about $8,000 right now." 8,000. I'd lost half my inheritance in 3 years. Should we pull it out?" I asked, feeling sick. No, Richard said quickly. "That's exactly the wrong thing to do. You only lose money if you sell when the market's down. We need to ride this out, wait for it to come back up." It made sense to me. After all, I didn't understand investing, and Richard did. If he said we should wait, we should wait. But then, in 1989, James died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 45 years old, and I was completely unprepared for widowhood at 41. The grief was overwhelming, but even worse was the panic about practical matters. For 18 years, James had handled everything financial. I didn't even know how much money we had in the bank, what bills needed to be paid, whether there was life insurance. Richard stepped in immediately, just like he had when Daddy died. "Don't worry, Eleanor. I'll help you sort through everything. James was smart. He set things up well. You'll be fine." It took Richard 3 weeks to sort through James's affairs. When he finally sat me down to explain our financial situation, the picture he painted was complicated. The good news is that James had a decent life insurance policy through the ranch, $75,000. The bad news is that you've got some debts to pay off. The mortgage on the house, some credit cards James had that you probably didn't know about, a loan against his truck. I stared at the papers he showed me, trying to make sense of all the numbers. There seemed to be a lot of debts I'd never heard of. After everything's paid off, Richard continued, you'll have about $23,000 left from the insurance, plus whatever's in your checking and savings accounts. But Eleanor, this house is too big for just you and Sarah. The upkeep, the utilities, the property taxes. It's going to eat up your money fast. He was right. The house felt enormous and empty without James. Sarah was 15 and would be leaving for college in a few years. It made sense to downsize. I think you should sell the house and move into something smaller, Richard advised. Maybe a nice apartment in town or one of those little rental houses near the school. That way you'll have the equity from this place to live on. So that's what we did. Richard handled everything. Finding a realtor, negotiating the sale price, helping me look for a smaller place to rent. The house sold for $89,000, and after paying the remaining mortgage and realtor fees, I walked away with $34,000. Combined with the insurance money and my small savings, I had about $60,000 total, enough to live modestly for several years if I was careful. Richard suggested I let him manage this money for me, just like he'd managed my inheritance from Daddy. The investment market's looking good right now, Eleanor. Much better than when we had that little setback in the 80s. I can probably get you a steady return of 8 or 10% annually. That would give you an extra $400 to $500 every month to live on. $400 or $500 a month sounded wonderful. My rent on the little 2-bedroom house near Sarah's school was only $420 a month, so that investment income would almost cover my housing completely. I signed the papers, again, trusting my big brother to take care of me because I was too stupid to take care of myself. And for a while, it seemed to work perfectly. Every month, Richard would deposit $450 into my checking account, my investment income. Combined with the part-time job I'd taken at the local library, I was managing to live independently for the first time in my life. It felt good, scary, but good. I was making my own decisions about groceries and household purchases, managing my own budget, even saving a little money each month. Sarah was proud of me. "You're doing great, Mum," she'd say. "I know Dad and Uncle Richard always said you weren't good with money, but look at you now." Look at me now indeed. For the first time in my adult life I felt competent, maybe even smart. But that feeling wouldn't last long. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to hit that like button. Trust me, we're just getting started, and what comes next, well, it's going to change everything. The first crack in my trust came in 1995, when Sarah was a senior in high school and started applying to colleges. We'd always assumed she'd go to the local community college for 2 years, then maybe transfer to Cal State Bakersfield if we could afford it. But Sarah was brilliant. Honour roll every semester, student body treasurer, captain of the debate team. Her guidance counsellor thought she had a real shot at some prestigious universities, maybe even with scholarship money. "Mum," she said one evening, spreading college brochures across our kitchen table, "what if I applied to Stanford or UC Berkeley? I know they're expensive, but with financial aid." My heart swelled with pride and broke with reality at the same time. "Honey, those schools cost more than I make in a year. Even with financial aid, we'd need thousands and thousands of dollars." "But what about my college fund?" Dad always said he was saving money for my education. College fund? James had never mentioned a college fund to me, but then again he'd never discussed our finances in detail. I don't know about any college fund, sweetheart. Let me ask Uncle Richard. He handled all of Dad's paperwork after... Richard's face went very still when I asked him about a college fund for Sarah. "Eleanor, James never had enough extra money to set up a separate college fund. You know how tight things were. The best he could do was make sure you'd have enough to live on after he was gone." But something about his expression bothered me. The way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. The way he shuffled through papers on his desk without really looking at them. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Sarah seems to remember him talking about saving for college." "Children misunderstand things," Richard said firmly. James was a good man, but he wasn't a wealthy man. There's no college fund, Eleanor. If Sarah wants to go to university, she'll need to find her own way. Scholarships, student loans, that sort of thing. Sarah did find her own way. She earned a partial scholarship to UC Davis and took out loans to cover the rest. I was so proud of her, but also heartbroken that I couldn't help more financially. "Don't worry about it, Mum," she assured me. "Lots of kids pay their own way through college. It'll make me appreciate it more." Such a wise, mature young woman. Sometimes I wondered how I'd managed to raise such a capable daughter when I felt so incapable myself. With Sarah away at college, my world became even smaller. Work at the library 3 days a week, grocery shopping, church on Sundays, and monthly dinners with Richard and his wife Patricia. It was a quiet life, but I'd convinced myself it was enough. The monthly investment payments continued like clockwork, $450 deposited into my checking account on the 15th of every month. After 6 years, I'd received over $32,000 in returns on my $60,000 investment. Richard was a financial genius, just like everyone always said. But in 2001, when I was 53 years old, I started having some health problems. Nothing serious, just some blood pressure issues and early signs of arthritis. But my doctor recommended I get my affairs in order, maybe write a will. "You're not dying, Eleanor," Dr. Martinez assured me, "but it's always smart to have these things documented, especially as a single woman." A will. I'd never thought about making a will before. What did I have to leave anyone? My little rental house was full of second-hand furniture and family photographs. My checking account usually had about $500 in it. I didn't own a car, never learned to drive after James died. But then I remembered, I had that investment account with Richard. By now, it must be worth quite a bit. My original $60,000 plus 6 years of growth, minus the monthly payments I'd been receiving. I called Richard to ask about the current value of my investments. "Why do you need to know that?" he asked, and there was something sharp in his voice. "I'm writing a will, and I need to know what assets I have." Long pause. "Eleanor, you don't need to worry about that right now. You're healthy. You're only 53. We can deal with estate planning later when you're older." "But Richard, I just want to know the current balance. It must be worth quite a bit by now, right?" Another pause. "The market's been volatile lately, up and down, you know. It's hard to give you an exact number." That didn't make sense to me. Didn't he get monthly statements? Wasn't he keeping track of how my money was doing? "Could you just check for me? I don't need an exact number, just a rough estimate." "Eleanor." His voice took on that patient, condescending tone I remembered from childhood. "This is exactly why I handle these things for you. You don't understand how investments work. The day-to-day numbers don't matter. What matters is long-term growth." "I understand that, but look, I'm busy right now. We'll talk about this later, okay?" He hung up before I could respond. Something cold settled in my stomach. In all the years Richard had been managing my money, he'd never refused to give me information before. Sure, he'd explain things in simplified terms like I was a child, but he'd never outright refused to answer a direct question. I tried calling back the next day, and the day after that. Richard was always in a meeting or with a client. When I finally reached him at home, he sounded irritated. "Eleanor, I told you we'd discuss this later. Can't you trust me to handle things? Haven't I always taken good care of your money?" "Yes, but—" "Then let me keep doing my job. You focus on your job at the library, and I'll focus on growing your investments." But I couldn't let it go. Something felt wrong, and for the first time in my adult life, I decided to trust that feeling instead of dismissing it. I started small. During my lunch breaks at the library, I began reading books about investing. Personal Finance for Dummies, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Making Money with Mutual Funds. Basic stuff that explained concepts I'd never bothered to learn. And you know what I discovered? I wasn't stupid. The concepts weren't that complicated. Risk and return, diversification, compound interest. It was all perfectly logical once someone explained it in plain English. More importantly, I learned that any investor has the right to receive regular statements showing exactly how their money is performing. Monthly statements, annual summaries, detailed breakdowns of every transaction. I'd never seen a single statement from my investment account. In 12 years of letting Richard manage my money, I'd never received one piece of paper showing where it was invested, how it was performing, or what fees were being charged. I'd simply trusted that the monthly $450 payments meant everything was going well. But now I understood enough to know that wasn't normal. That wasn't how legitimate investment accounts worked. My hands were actually shaking when I called Richard's bank and asked to speak with him about my account. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the receptionist said, "but Mr. Morrison is no longer with First National. He retired last year." Retired? Richard was only 68, and why hadn't he told me? "Could you tell me who's handling his former client's accounts?" "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss client information over the phone. You'd need to come in with proper identification and account documentation." Account documentation? What account documentation did I have? Richard had always kept all the paperwork for safekeeping. I drove to the bank the next day, took a taxi actually, since I still didn't drive. The new investment manager, a young man named Tommy Phillips, was very polite but very confused. "Ma'am, I've searched our system thoroughly, and I don't show any investment accounts under your name. Are you sure your account was with First National?" My brother Richard Morrison managed my investments through this bank for over 12 years. Tommy's expression changed. Richard Morrison? He was before my time, but, "Ma'am, I think you need to speak with our branch manager." The branch manager was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Chen, who looked very uncomfortable when I explained my situation. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to be very careful about what I can and cannot tell you due to privacy regulations. But what I can say is that Richard Morrison did not manage client investment accounts through this bank. His position was in commercial lending, not investment services." The room started spinning around me. But he's been sending me monthly payments for 12 years, $450 every month." "Ma'am, those payments didn't come from any bank investment account. I don't know where they came from, but they didn't come from us." I sat in that bank for 2 hours, going through every piece of documentation I brought with me. The papers I'd signed when James died, the papers from Daddy's estate, every document I could find with Richard's signature on it. Mrs. Chen looked at everything very carefully, sometimes consulting with other employees, sometimes making phone calls to verify information. Finally, she sat back down across from me with a very serious expression. "Mrs. Patterson, I think you need to contact a lawyer." The lawyer I found, a woman named Janet Rodriguez, who specialized in financial fraud, took my case on a contingency basis after hearing my story. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I need you to understand that what your brother did was theft, systematic, long-term theft. Based on what you've told me, he's stolen at least $200,000 from you over the years, possibly more." $200,000. The number was so large I couldn't even process it emotionally. "How is that possible?" "Let's start with your father's estate," Janet explained, spreading papers across her desk. "You said Richard told you there was $31,000 left after expenses, and you each got $15,500. "Yes. I've pulled the public records. Your father's house sold for $47,000, and his life insurance was $15,000. The funeral cost $3,200. There were no other significant debts. After expenses, there should have been about $58,000 left in the estate." $58,000, not $31,000. Richard had lied about $27,000 right from the start. "Then there's your husband's life insurance," Janet continued. "You said Richard told you James had $75,000 in coverage, but after debts you only received $23,000. "That's right." I contacted the ranch where James worked. His life insurance was actually $125,000, and according to their records, the only debt he had was the mortgage on your house. No credit cards, no loan against his truck. 125,000, not 75,000, and James had been debt-free except for the house payment. Eleanor, after paying off your mortgage and funeral expenses, you should have received about $95,000 from James's insurance, not $23,000. 95,000. Richard had stolen $72,000 from my husband's life insurance. But what about the monthly payments? I asked weakly. He's been sending me $450 every month for 12 years. Janet did some quick calculations. That's about $65,000 total over 12 years, so even if we credit him with those payments, he still stole at least $134,000 from the insurance money and estate combined. And my investment principal, the $60,000 I gave him to invest? Based on what you've told me, there never were any investments. Those monthly payments were just Richard giving you back small portions of your own money, probably to keep you from asking too many questions. My own money. For 12 years I'd been grateful to my brother for giving me an allowance out of my own stolen inheritance. The full scope of Richard's betrayal took weeks to uncover. Janet hired a forensic accountant who traced money through bank records, real estate transactions, and investment accounts. The final number was $247,000. Over a period of 15 years, my brother had systematically stolen almost $250,000 from me. Money that should have paid for Sarah's college education. Money that could have let me buy a house instead of paying rent for 20 years. Money that could have given me security, independence, choices. Instead, Richard had used my money to buy his big house, his new cars, his vacations. While I'd been cutting coupons and shopping at thrift stores, he'd been living off my inheritance. But here's what hurt even more than the money. The lies. The constant message that I was too stupid to handle my own affairs. The condescending pats on the head. The way he'd made me feel grateful for his help while he was robbing me blind. I was 65 years old when I finally understood the truth. 65 years old and furious in a way I'd never allowed myself to be furious before. Richard had taken advantage of my grief, my trust, and my carefully cultivated ignorance. He'd stolen my money, my confidence, and my choices. But he hadn't stolen my capacity to fight back, and that's exactly what I did. The lawsuit took 18 months to work its way through the courts. Richard hired expensive lawyers who argued that I'd willingly given him power of attorney, that I'd been grateful for his financial management, that I was now suffering from age-related confusion about events that had happened years earlier. But Janet Rodriguez was thorough and relentless. She had documentation for every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every lie Richard had told. She had bank records showing where my money had gone, and tax returns showing income Richard couldn't explain. Most importantly, she had me. At 66 years old, I testified in court about the lifetime of manipulation and financial abuse I'd endured. I spoke clearly and precisely about every detail of Richard's theft. I answered every question the defence lawyers asked without backing down or getting confused. I was not the scattered, helpless woman Richard had trained me to believe I was. I was an intelligent person who had been systematically deceived by someone I trusted. The jury agreed. They awarded me $247,000 in damages, plus another $150,000 in punitive damages, nearly $400,000 total. Richard's big house went up for sale 2 weeks after the verdict. His new Buick was repossessed. His retirement account was garnished. At age 70, he had to move into a small apartment and find part-time work to survive. Some people might think I should have felt sorry for him. After all, he was my brother. We'd grown up in the same house, learned our prayers from the same mother. But I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt free. With the money from the lawsuit, I bought a small house near the library where I work. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom bungalow with a garden in the back where I grow tomatoes and roses. But it's mine, completely, legally, undeniably mine. I learned to drive at age 67, got my licence on the second try and bought a reliable used Honda Civic. Now I can go anywhere I want, any time I want, without asking permission or depending on anyone else. I opened my own investment account at a different bank and spent months learning how to manage it myself. It's not complicated once you understand the basics, and I sleep better at night knowing exactly where every dollar is and how it's performing. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own judgment. When something doesn't feel right, I investigate instead of dismissing my concerns. When someone tries to tell me I'm too stupid to understand something, I prove them wrong. Sarah finished law school last year, paid for with money from my settlement. She's working for a firm that specialises in elder abuse cases, helping other people who've been taken advantage of by family members or caregivers. "You inspired me, Mum," she told me at her graduation. "Watching you fight back, watching you reclaim your life, it showed me what real strength looks like." Real strength. Not the kind of strength that comes from dominating other people, but the kind that comes from refusing to be dominated. Richard and I don't speak anymore. I see him occasionally around town, a smaller, older man who avoids eye contact when our paths cross. Patricia divorced him 6 months after the lawsuit ended. His children rarely visit. He destroyed his family relationships for money that was never rightfully his. He gave up love for greed, and in the end, he lost everything that actually mattered. As for me, I wake up every morning in my own house, make coffee in my own kitchen, and decide for myself how to spend my day. I volunteer at the literacy centre, teaching adults to read. I take art classes at the community college. I travel sometimes, nothing extravagant, but I've seen the Grand Canyon and walked on the beaches of Monterey. I'm 73 years old, and I'm finally living my own life on my own terms. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I think they're wrong about that. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about reclaiming what was taken from you. It's about refusing to let someone else's actions define your worth. It's about learning, finally, that you were never the person they told you that you were. You were always stronger, smarter, and more capable than they wanted you to believe, and it's never, ever too late to prove it. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, your voice matters, your worth is not negotiable, and you deserve to be treated with respect and honesty by the people who claim to love you. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to stay silent anymore.